This afternoon, we're going to continue our talk. It will be elongated or expanded in the sense that last week when we met, we talked just about the war in Vietnam, which was enough. But that war was located in Southeast Asia. And as one scholar pointed out, this was the time when the United States went into a new phase, the rise to globalism, so that we decided to surround the Soviet Union with military pacts. And you know the most famous one is NATO. But there was also CENTO, which tied Turkey to Iran to Pakistan. India wanted to have nothing to do with us, and they wanted neutrality, and so they did not join. But the group that we were interested in was called SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And then nobody would have anything to do with Japan, given the horrors of the war that had just passed. So we signed a peace treaty with Japan here in San Francisco in the Opera House. And we signed an alliance with them, which is the famous American-Japanese treaty. But we're most interested in SEATO because it had no holding pattern and it could not take the strain. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that there was a very famous woman, Barbara Tuchman. She was related to a very famous Jewish family in Chicago. The head of that family had served with FDR in the New Deal in World War II. And after the war, he suggested that Germany be completely ruralized, that is, Germany not recover economically, but be turned into a farming zone. This is not a very smart plan, and it never got much push. But it showed you the thinking of some people who were influential, and one of the people was Barbara Tuchman. Barbara wrote a book, a very famous book. It had to do with the coming of World War I. The problem was she really was talking about the coming of World War II. And she was making the Germans of the Kaiser's era into the Germans of Hitler's time. But unfortunately, it took off, and particularly for John Fitzgerald Kennedy, our new president. So when Kennedy went to Europe on one of his first trips, he gave copies of Tuchman's book to all of the Allies. And this made them wonder, what was he trying to do? Pass a message? It was not very effective. And SEATO was not effective. Now, I'll tell you a little story. Once upon a time, there was a hotel in Saigon. Once upon a time, a very, very famous British scholar sat in that hotel and wrote a book. The book suggested that the Americans were going to intervene in Vietnam, and the hero of the book was sitting in the very same hotel I used to sit in, eating their very famous crab and corn soup. In the process, he described, this author, by the way, is Graham Greene. Can you hear all right in the back? The author was Graham Greene. And the author's book was The Quiet American. And in that book, which was written very early before there were many Americans in Vietnam, there was a description of the Americans who would come. And the hero of the book is a CIA operative. So already you have a prediction of a war that's going to be eating up most of the resources of Southeast Asia. So beyond Graham Greene, who wrote many very famous books, Quiet American resonated. It was made into a couple of movies. One starred the most famous soldier from World War II, Audie Murphy. He wasn't much of an actor, but it was a powerful film. So what we want to know is that, one, John Kennedy bought the idea of Barbara Tuchman's book and gave copies of it to the Western world's leaders. And the book was based on a wrong assumption, as was Vietnam policy. Let me get it very clear to you. In Vietnam, most of the leadership in this country believed in a domino effect. That is, if Vietnam fell, then Thailand would fall, Malaysia would fall, and all of Southeast Asia would fall. And that's not true. But if you believe it long enough, it can lead to some really bad consequences. If you know anything about Southeast Asia, it's resource rich. If you know anything about it, it was conquered by the Japanese. That's the reason why the Japanese couldn't get anybody to sign a treaty with them. People were very upset with the Japanese in World War II and afterwards. But you should know something more about Southeast Asia. The Philippines had never wanted to be an American colony. That's an American myth. The Philippines wanted independence. They finally got it after, in fact, the Japanese attacked us in the Philippines. You know, I know all of you think that the Japanese only attacked Hawaii and the fleet, but that's not true. The same day they attacked Hawaii, they attacked Subic Bay in the Philippines and Clark Air Force Base. So both sides were in the war. And later, when they got rid of us, the Philippines had to go under their own war conditions. They had a group of people on the far left who wanted to change things. They were called the Hooks, H-U-K. And so you have a war going on in the Philippines, and a guy named Lansdale helps them, and they win. But they won their own war against a revolutionary group, just like we're going to try and get the Vietnamese to win. The next were the Malaysians. The Malays also wanted to get out from under British control, but they had their own insurrection going on. And so they got the British to come in. British are very funny people. They have this very ancient woman as a monarch, but they can be very irregular in their behavior. So when the British came into Malaya, and to put down the insurrection there, they would just walk away from the Malay group while the Malay commander cut the head off of the tribal leader, so that in no time there was no problem in Malaya. So you have the Philippines, then you have Malaya. There are a constant series of ongoing revolutions that are taking up the time of most of Southeast Asia. In the meantime, the writer is sitting in that hotel writing his book about our coming disaster. It's a very predictive book. So we move on from there to the fact that when SEATO didn't work, and we paid a lot of money to get it to work. This was the treaty arrangement that we made with the Southeast Asians and us. We paid a lot for it, and it still didn't work. For instance, we have a very fine Korean gentleman with us today who worked, I believe, in the Korean Foreign Service, what we would call the Foreign Service. We convinced the Koreans to come into the war with us in Vietnam. They sent a whole division to Vietnam, and they sent them down without any equipment. And when they got there, they then wanted us to equip them, which cost us a fortune. We had built in the middle of Vietnam a big base called Cam Ranh Bay, still there. It's taken over by the Russians, the Soviets, after we were defeated. So here was a Korean division, 16,000 plus, now being refitted by us before it went back. And every time they rotated a Korean group in, they came without or with old equipment and left with new. So it was very advantageous for the generals in Seoul to see their army being refitted by the Americans. In the case of the Thais, they didn't play that trick. The Thai government, to get along with the Americans, sent the Queen's Cobras, which was also a very large military group. We were trying to create the feeling that the war that we were running was run by all of SEATO. We were all together in this effort. This effort was to protect the rights of the Vietnamese people. But it didn't go well. And particularly when the domino theory didn't work, we didn't have any theory. In other words, if Saigon and Vietnam fell, then Laos would fall, then Cambodia would fall, then Thailand would fall, then Malaysia would fall, and on it would go until all of Southeast Asia was swept into the orbit of the communists. Now, one thing we didn't know, which seems strange given all the effort we spent trying to know, was that there had been a split in the communist world. You probably didn't bother to watch or listen, and nobody told you. That when Khrushchev gave a very famous speech to the communist leadership in the Soviet Union, he pointed out all the faults of Stalin. It's a very famous telling of the dirty deeds of Stalin against other Russians. There was somebody in Beijing who did not appreciate that speech. His name was Mao Zedong. So without the Americans seeming to pick up on the fact, there was an enormous split between the Soviets and the Red Chinese, a split that was only going to be recognized much later when Henry Kissinger and Richard Mullhouse Nixon take advantage and go themselves on that famous trip to China. I don't even know how that trip took place, but the announcement was that Henry Kissinger was on a trip to India, a regular diplomatic trip. But in fact, he'd only gone to India to catch another plane that took him over the Himalaya Mountains into Beijing, where he met with Zhou Enlai, set up the famous Nixon-Mao Zedong. And if you're an opera lover, you might know that Adams here in the Berkeley area wrote an opera on this. Nixon in China, it's called. Really quite good. But that takes us far away from the Southeast Asian problem. Southeast Asian problem was critical. We no longer had a theory anyone believed in, that is the domino theory. And we had a real problem in trying to keep a government afloat. The government we had, unfortunately, had fallen into the hands of No Dinh Diem. No, unfortunately, was a Roman Catholic in a country that was around 100% Buddhist. In the process of trying to run this country, it's a very convoluted story because the French only got back to Vietnam because the British Navy brought them there. Then the French lost out in the famous battle at Dien Bien Phu, of which we have a very famous book. Hell is a very small place. Then we suddenly have this problem over again of what to do. The French are out. We've met in Geneva. The Americans are there, the British are there, the French are obviously there, and the Vietnamese sides are there. And the solution was not a happy one for anybody. Ngo Dinh Diem wanted all of Vietnam for himself, and he couldn't have it. Ho Chi Minh wanted all of Vietnam for himself, but he couldn't have it, so he split at the 17th parallel. 17th to the north, and to the south, the 17th would be Ho Chi Minh's lost territory. So you have now a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. Now you might have asked, didn't anybody at any time ever notice this guy named Ho Chi Minh? And the answer is yes. Back in World War II, it was a case that all of the Vietnamese were fighting the Japanese. All of the Vietnamese to include Ho Chi Minh. And somebody knew that. Somebody who was very young from Georgia, who later became Secretary of State to Kennedy. His name was Dean Rusk, that's right. Went on to teach law at Athens, Georgia, when he retired from the government. He was a great guy. He was a very good friend of mine, and he openly said, you know, when asked about Vietnam, we in the Kennedy administration have to admit we were wrong. Well, it was a little late after 1,000, almost 500,000 dead. But Dean Rusk did meet Ho Chi Minh because Ho was very vigorously fighting the Japanese who had occupied all of Vietnam and had used Vietnam as a rice basket. It was a very rich colony for the French, and now it was going to feed the Japanese Empire. And you have to understand how important it was for everybody to see what was happening. Here are all these very famous European colonial powers, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Americans in the Philippines, the French in Indochina, and back and behind them, the British and the British Raj in India. And now when the Japanese defeated them all, the locals saw that these people were not invincible at all. That if France could lose Indochina to the Japanese, they could lose Indochina to the Vietnamese. And so it was very easy for those who were smart enough and had studied enough to understand that they could, in fact, take over the country for themselves. And they did. There's a very famous film with Sigourney Weaver and Mel Gibson. It's about the very collapse in Indonesia of Indonesian power. It's rather difficult to explain to you, but overseas Chinese, in many instances, were a third of the Southeast Asians' population. When you came to Saigon, the capital in the south, one whole section of Saigon was Cholan, and Cholan was a Chinese city, and the Chinese controlled the rice trade, and they sold all the rice coming out of South Vietnam. But that was true also. Singapore was a totally overseas Chinese city, so much so that the Malays, when they got independence, didn't want Singapore to be part of them. Their capital is Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore went its own way, became a city-state. And it was worse when you got down to Manila, but when you got to Indonesia, it was a bloodbath. The Indonesians wanted the Chinese out, and so when they couldn't convince them to go, they just killed thousands of them in a very famous bloodbath. And the film that Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver make is about that terrible time in Indonesia. So you have a series of people rejecting the settlement, and they reject it in different ways. You get rid of the overseas Chinese, and you also get rid of the Europeans. And so it was obvious that we were fighting an uphill battle. there was no way that the country called Vietnam was going to go in the direction the Americans wanted to. As hard as we tried, as hard as Jack Kennedy worked, and then he was dead, as hard as LBJ worked, and then he was gone. And then we had the meeting, a famous meeting right at the end of LBJ's term in 1968. You might remember 1968. The cities in America were on fire. Revolution was here at home. Berkeley campus was tear gassed by Ronald Reagan. So, using the old group called the Wise Men, LBJ called a conference in the White House. And Clark Clifford, a very famous Democrat, headed the conference. And their report shocked Johnson. The report simply said, no matter the cost, no matter what you'll have to do, you have to end this war. It's tearing the country to pieces. And so we began those famous discussions in Paris. And in those discussions, first, the Vietnamese communists made it difficult for us. They wanted to play up against Johnson's little bit of strength. So they argued about the size of the table and where it should be located. Finally, there is a famous building in Paris, right on the Place de la Concorde, where we finally met and came to an agreement. That agreement was for us to get out. And by getting out, we would get out also of Southeast Asia. We held on to a few bases for a while. We still try and use now Subic in the Philippines and Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. But in general, we are gone from Southeast Asia. We have our embassies there. But the powerful state in South Asia is India. And they wanted to have nothing to do with us from the beginning. They believed in no alliance systems. And so they stayed out of the war and gave us no help and assistance. So it became more and more difficult for the very pieces to fit together. And I've said this with you before, that in the case of Dean Rusk, who became a very good friend, I called him and said, I'd like to come down and interview you for my book. And he said, fine. So I went down. And he told me that I could come back anytime. He wanted everyone to know that he believed that we had simply been wrong. We had been wrong from the beginning and we were wrong at the end. So I did go back several times. And then he said to me, you don't have to come all the way here. You can connect with a microphone phone call to me from your office in Berkeley. And I said, could I do that with my students? And he said, yes. So I became very famous on the campus of running a class on Vietnam. And one of the presentations that I presented was a live hookup with Dean Rusk talking directly to the students, trying to explain to the students who found this really quizzical, particularly when it came to subjects like this. Vietnam has two climates, rainy, dry, rainy, dry. And because of this, and because it's so tropical, it has a feature. The landscape is dominated by triple canopy jungle. That means one level of the canopy is around 6 feet tall. Then another level is around 12 or 14. And then another level is as high as it can go. And so you could never see anything. When I used to fly in my little helicopter, I couldn't see anything but green. But there was somebody beneath that green. So what did we decide to do? Well, maybe you've heard the scandal in Wuhan today. There's two ways you can blame COVID. COVID either jumped from an animal to the human, or COVID was created in a laboratory in Wuhan and got out of the laboratory by mistake and came to kill millions of people. Some people believe one story and some people believe the other, but it is not unimaginable because we created Agent Orange, a chemical weapon to destroy the Cripple Canopy jungle. It was very effective. You flew over it, you sprayed the agent, it was very persistent. It didn't wash off, it didn't run off. It's very like mustard gas in World War I. When it was used, it was very effective because it hung on to every plant, every little thing it touched, and then it hung on to you and burnt blisters on your skin. So now we have Agent Orange, a creation of the Americans, a chemical weapon. We had signed a treaty that we would not develop chemical weapons. Very famous CBR treaty, chemical and biological. So this was really terrible because it was persistent. Americans later went through those parts of the jungles and they themselves caught cancer and died. So we not only killed the enemy, we killed our own. Agent Orange, a very ugly picture of what the war turned out to be, and a very ugly view of us, because after we were gone, the Agent Orange was still there, killing children and others who walked through the forest. Again, it's a country of two features. It's a rainy season, which doesn't wash off Agent Orange to any very great degree, and a dry season. So this was the first disaster that we had to deal with in coming to grips with the failure of our overall plan. We also had the problem of our first Catholic president. He never could get over the fact that the New family, Nodium New, the head of the secret police, and Nodium Zim, the head president, were devout Roman Catholics. And over 1 million of those devout Roman Catholics had lived in the north, in Hanoi and Haiphong, and they all transferred out in that 1 month that you had at the signing of the treaty in Geneva to switch. They switched south, and the North Vietnamese types who wanted to live under communism, they went north. Now with all these Catholics in the south, unfortunately, the Buddhists did not appreciate some of the tendencies of the Catholics. And the Buddhists began to demonstrate. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen various ways of demonstrating. The ones the Buddhists had was to send an aging old bonze, an old monk, and dope him up so that he's just full of dope, and cart him in a truck to a big intersection in Saigon, in Hue, in any of the other cities of Mito and Kanto, and there have him sit in the lotus position, and then pour gasoline over his head, and then light a match. This only made the situation worse, and particularly for Kennedy. So trying to keep the lid on, in case you don't know it, most of Southeast Asia is Buddhist. There was a desperate attempt by the Kennedy administration. We did everything we could. Kennedy said, I've got to get somebody in who's good. So first he put in Maxwell Taylor, a wonderful general from World War II. Max couldn't work it out, so he left. I used to see him playing tennis at the Cercle Sportif in Saigon. Good tennis player, not very much good as an ambassador. And then to share the blame with the Republicans, because remember Kennedy, if anything, he was a politician. He sent John Cabot Lodge, that was his name? It was Cabot Lodge anyway, to be his ambassador in Saigon. And then with things not working at all, he decided to play out a version of a very famous T.S. Eliot play called Murder in the Cathedral. In fact, he didn't want him murdered. What he wanted was for Cabot Lodge to meet with the generals over at Tan Son Nhut Air Base and say to them, we're going to flash the green light for you to stage a coup d'etat. And this will mean that you will have our permission to support a coup against your elected government. And they did. Lodge sent the signal. The two brothers, Nodim Zim, the president, living in the palace in Jardin, and his brother, Nodim Nu, escaped from the palace and went to an underground passage to the Catholic Church in Cholan, the Chinese district. The generals soon discovered where he was located, and so they asked to parley. And they promised Nodim Zim and Nodim Nu that if they surrendered, and they would send an armored personnel carrier furnished by the Americans, pick them up, they would be sent out of the country in exile. And so they knew not what to do. Nodim Nu's very famous and glamorous mother, his wife, was in the United States at the time, Madame Nu. Madame Nu became one of the famous dragon ladies. I don't know if you know where the term dragon lady comes from. It comes from a comic strip I used to read as a kid called Terry and the Pirates. And when you see Terry and the Pirates, you see this very dangerous woman, obviously Asian, who's a threat to Terry, who's doing good all over Asia. Again, it's a comic strip. And now we had them in the flesh. We had Madame Chenault, another dragon lady who had been married to an American general, Claire Chenault. And now we have Madame Nu. We also had Madame Chiang Kai-shek. There were madames all over the place, and always dangerous. So Madame Nu made herself very unwelcome in the United States because she came to California. California was the seat of I know you think the state has always been Republican. In fact, always been Democratic. In fact, it's always been Republican. We had two Republican senators, both males, Nolan and Knight, and they were the head of the China lobby. So what to do? Well, Madame Nu came here and visited, and then she said to the press, who found her very controversial but interesting copy, that every nation should, quote, have a Buddhist barbecue. Well, this lit up the sky. Kennedy didn't know what to do. You had Madame Nu on his hands, right here in the United States, right in California. And you had this problem in Saigon. So Kennedy gave the green light to launch the coup d'etat. And they launched it. The generals found that Nu and Nodim Zim had escaped to the church in Saigon. They said they would send a APC, an armored personnel carrier that we had furnished, and he would then been given free passage to go out of Vietnam for good, to go into exile. So they came out of the church, went in the back of the armored personnel carrier, and the carrier went to our headquarters in Tan Son Nhut, the air base. And when the back of the armored personnel carrier came down, in the back were 2 dead bodies. They had been stabbed to death many times and shot for good measure. So we had carried out the execution. Kennedy had blood on his hands. He got the message when he was at a meeting in the White House, and he blanched and turned white and ran out of the room. And now we went through a series of god-awful generals running South Vietnam. We ended up finally with General Chu, a man who was going to go through the peace process, because by then we had Nixon as president, and Nixon was determined to get out of the war at whatever the cost. And since Johnson had been given the same message by Clark and all the other wise men that he'd lost the war, there was nothing else seemingly to do. And now the Southeast Asian governments were getting very much afraid. In the history of Asia, China is known as the Great Dragon, not in a positive way at all. And then if anything, Vietnam as a country is known as the Little Dragon. And Vietnam has had terrible, terrible relations through the year, the decades, the centuries with China. 2 of her national heroes are 2 young girls who were revolutionaries against the Chinese when the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty of over 1,000 years ago, invaded Vietnam. It was these 2 young girls who led the Vietnamese in pushing them out. And then later, when we're pushed out, the Vietnamese go to war with the Chinese. So it's a very dangerous place to go and get involved in. And we went, got involved, and we lost. And as I say again, when Secretary of State Dean Rusk looked at me and he said, "We were wrong. All of our assumptions were wrong. There was no domino effect at all. Nothing fell because Vietnam fell." So the problem was what to do. Well, we've done it. You know, you can go to Vietnam today and 90% of the people weren't alive then. And those that were are not angry with us, even though they still have cases of Agent Orange. And so when you go there, you can see, you know, we have a very famous Senator, McCain. He was shot down over Vietnam, made prisoner. And the place that he was kept in Hanoi, the prison, is now a tourist site. You can go and sit on the bed where he slept and meet the people who knew him. Hanoi is a very beautiful city, by the way. It's surrounded by lakes, and it's very famous for its port city, Haiphong, which we tried to cut off but weren't able to do. You might know a chapter of that from your history books. There is off near Haiphong, South China Sea. And in the South China Sea, there's a section called Tonkin Bay. And in the case of Tonkin Bay, we used to put how to put this to you? We knew that the North Vietnamese were slipping people south by using the ocean. And we were also slipping people north, all the way to the city of Vinh, which is on the North Vietnamese coast. But on beyond that was an area that we decided to put a major American naval force off of the coast of North Vietnam. And on a dark and stormy night, the North Vietnamese attacked this American naval force, giving rise to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It happened twice. In the first case, there is no doubt that these very feisty North Vietnamese torpedo boats did attack the American naval ships in Tonkin Bay, and that led to the very famous Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which got enormous support from the Congress, again sending the wrong message to the American people. The second attack was not likely there. It was, you have to understand that 18-year-old American sailors on a warship in hostile waters are very jumpy. And anything they see on the radar, they're coming, they're coming, they're coming. And they obviously misread. And so they reported, again, another North Vietnamese raid. But there's no evidence that that took place. But it took place in the mind of the American Congress, which thought we have to do something to teach these people. So we have the very famous Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which was backed up 100% by the Congress. It left Johnson by then a clear way to get this war over with. So maybe you've heard of another term. We have in our inventory of awful weapons B-52s. And we can conduct massive strikes with them because we can send 20 B-52s all at one time. And these B-52s were stationed very near in Okinawa, a Japanese island that we controlled. So suddenly these well-known arc strikes would strike, and they'd come down. The Chinese saw them, Chinese communists saw them leave Okinawa, and they traced them on their radar, saw that they were going to South Vietnam. What they were going to do was to plaster these people to death with enormous numbers of bombs. So we, in our wisdom, ended up dropping more bombs on South Vietnam than we dropped on Hitler's Germany. Hard to believe. We didn't have B-52s during the time of Hitler's Germany. And it would light up the sky. You would be in bed when I was on a rubber plantation, I was on a cot with an air mattress, and the whole thing would rattle. The tent, the posts, and you. And later when I was in Saigon, the whole building would rattle. Arc strikes, and they didn't do anything. One of the days when I had to brief General Max Taylor, along with Admiral Zumwalt, if you know anything about Admiral Zumwalt. He's a very famous modern admiral. So he let the Navy people who were in the war zone grow beards. They didn't have to shave. That was his contribution. And anyway, I briefed them and told them what a messy job it was, because we had a group of young men who were ARPs, Aerial Rifle Platoon, airborne. And they'd have to go after every ARC strike, no matter where it was, even if it was in difficult territory, and count the number of dead. Most of the time, the dead were an elephant. There were elephants in Vietnam. There were other jungle elements. There were also very dangerous snakes, poisonous snakes called kraits. So war turned messier and messier. McNamara was determined to get a body count. He was a very much type of man who thought, all right, how many people live in Vietnam today? How many of them live in the North Vietnam? All right, let's say it's 300 million. We will then find how many we can kill so that the number will go down so low they will not be able to continue this war. Well, it was stupid. And they were able to continue. They flooded their way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This famous trail went through Laos and Cambodia and then entered Vietnam. So what did Nixon do? He invaded Cambodia. So now we have the famous killing fields, because years later, the North Vietnamese come in and try and straighten things out in Cambodia, and they end up with a lot of dead. So everywhere you turned, there were nothing but tragic circumstances through Southeast Asia. We tried everything we could and none of it worked. I told you last time that we had these series of weapons. They weren't real weapons. They were as tall as I am, 6 foot tall. And they were shaped to look camouflaged, painted, and they had whip antennas on some of them. And when they didn't have that, they were called an aquaboy, a system of picking up noise. And we would drop them on the jungle, this famous triple canopy jungle. And then we would wait to see what we heard, and we had mountain bombs. It's a funny country. There are not a lot of mountains, but there was one, Nguyen Ba Dinh, in South Vietnam, and we put a team up there. And then we could listen down to these items that would resonate when something live went by. Many times something live was an elephant, so the elephant got plastered. You have to understand that the Viet Cong owned the night. They were the locals. They knew how to move. They knew when to move. We would sometimes see them fishing at night. There were great stretch of rice paddies that cover most of the Mekong Delta, are great fishing places. So they go out to catch fish. And we had the option of firing at them or not. We didn't dare go out at night because the Viet Cong did own the night. I don't know what else I can tell you that makes it even more realistic to you. But we had bases that extended over into the Thai country. And the Thai government was very cooperative, but didn't want to get involved. And they did little to help us. But as our bases spread, as our war spread, as it went into Laos, it only got worse and worse. We even had an incident after the war was more or less over with the Marquez. It was a ship we thought was moving illicit items around. And we went to charge in. We had a military incident. It's all gone now. It was a time and a different time. I think I'm just about running out of time, so rather than boring you to death with a repeat, let me say that John Kennedy's greatest mistake probably was buying all of that crap and getting involved in the war. It was possible. Well, let me tell you how Eisenhower handled it. That's a better case. Eisenhower was president for 8 years, as you know, the sleepy 8 years of Dwight David Eisenhower, who spent most of his presidency playing golf. But he was in the White House, in the Oval Office, because he'd been asked to meet with his vice president, which was, of course, Richard Nixon. And Admiral Radford would come along. Radford was the chief of naval operations, this senior Navy pilot. And they came in, greeted the president, and the president said, "What's up?" And they said, "Well, we have a strong suggestion for you. We think you should use nuclear weapons in Vietnam to save the French at Dien Bien Phu, because the French are our ally, and this would be the perfect time to strike." Eisenhower was appalled, to say the least. The decision to use nuclear weapons had not been favorable on all parts anyway, at Hiroshima or at Nagasaki. The man who built the nuclear weapons for the United States was a nuclear physicist at Berkeley. And he had wanted, if we were going to use them at all, to do it on an isolated island. And instead, of course, we had done it in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Two terrible, terrible results. So think what you want of that. The idea that you would get the President of the United States to use nuclear weapons to help the French at Dien Bien Phu was unbelievable. That's not what Eisenhower said. Eisenhower said, "Well, I tell you what, why don't the two of you go down to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and present this idea to the Congress of the United States?" Well, Dick Nixon was wise enough to know that the Congress was never going to support this. It'd have to be a presidential decision. So that was the end of the idea of using nuclear weapons. That just shows you how desperate we were at the very beginning, before we even had a soldier, before Graham Greene had ever written his famous book. It was pathetic, but it was what it was, and it entailed the presidencies of Eisenhower. Eisenhower did all he could to help in Vietnam. He sent aid, and he sent assistance, but that was it. It was up to John Kennedy to send the military in. And he did. He sent special forces in. He sent the famous Green Berets. Perhaps you know about the Green Berets from John Wayne's notorious film. There are other films about Vietnam. Some of them were good, some not so good. There's a rather famous Polish writer who left Poland, went to England, and wrote some of the greatest books that were ever turned out in England. And one is called The Heart of Darkness. Francis Ford Coppola took that serious book and made a very, very messy job of turning it into a movie. Anyone who's ever seen it remembers it, because it takes off with Wagner's famous music, The Ride of the Valkyrie. And the Valkyrie, in this case, are all helicopters, mounted gunships. And they're flying at what we call Earth circumference, meaning they were only a couple of feet above the ocean. And they come screaming in, blasting away with napalm to this coastal village somewhere in Vietnam, killing all the people. And then the film continues. You know this basic story of Heart of Darkness. There is a senior American who goes AWOL. He goes up a river and meets a tribe, almost prehistoric conditions, and lives with them. His name is Kurtz. Well, to make this movie even more unbelievable, a very, very fat and rotund Marlon Brando, with his head shaven, plays that role of Kurtz. And Francis Ford Coppola spent a fortune making this movie, which isn't even anywhere near as powerful as a small book called Heart of Darkness. That kind of movie and others like it followed. Movies with Robert De Niro. Even got a famous movie star involved. She got a name she never did appreciate. She was known as Hanoi Jane. Jane Fonda, who was part of that whole group of people who demonstrated against the war in Vietnam, actually went to Hanoi and had her photo taken where she was mounting a gun that was being used to shoot down American pilots. So needless to say, Hanoi Jane was not many people's favorite film star after that. And I think we have someone who lives in our building who helped Jane Fonda with her mission. I think she's the Chinese lady who many of you have met in the dining room. She doesn't work here, she lives here. But it went through lots of people's families. You had a lot of young Americans who were determined to avoid the draft. So when their draft number came up, they went to Canada, or they went to Scandinavia, Sweden in particular. They were not going to be drafted. There were people who were burning draft cards. Clark Clifford was right when he told President Johnson, this war is tearing the nation to pieces, and you must end it no matter what the cost. And so they did. Now I'm getting into your time. So we're going to change things a little around here. July is coming up. July the 4th is coming up. Before that, July the 1st, July the 2nd, and July the 3rd, we're showing you in the Friendship Room 3 films, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. Those films will be on Ken Burns' epic coverage of the great American writer Ernest Hemingway. So you'll have that on July 1, July 2, July 3, and then after that we'll have the next talk by me, and the next talk by me will be on Ernest Hemingway. And then we will have a festival on Ernest Hemingway, we hope. You can see some of his films because as a writer, he was very filmable. and even some of his poorer work are very good films. Anyway, it's coming up to be changed in July from a Hemingway special and then from Hemingway himself. So until I see you again, thank you very much.